think we are starting our session now. We just waited a couple of minutes to see if other people would join, but no more time to lose. So welcome everyone. My name is Cibele Queiroz. I'm a researcher at the Global Resilience Partnership and the Stockholm Resilience Center. And I will be hosting this session together with my colleagues, Albert Nordström and Cedric de Koning, who is also one of our four brilliant panelists. And the session today will be about this contested use of resilience approaches to peace building. Resilience has in the recent years emerged as a key concept in peace building, mainly also as a reaction to the dominant focus on external interventions. But the reason why we are here today, it's because this use of resilience in peace building has been contested and criticized by different scholars and experts from different fields. So we thought we wanted to have an honest and quite confrontative dialogue also about whether resilience actually can add value to peace building, or if in the contrary it can bring risks or even undermine peace building processes. And for that we invited four panelists with a broad experience in this area and coming from academia and practice to share their different perspectives on resilience in a constructive but confrontative discussion. So we will start, I'm just going to run you through the session a little bit. So we'll start with a half an hour panel discussion, which will be moderated by Robyn Kriel, who is a journalist and a former CNN correspondent. And then we will move into sort of having 20 minutes breakup group discussions, where you will also have the chance in your group. We will have four groups, so in each group there will be one of the panelists, so you will also have the chance to interact with them a bit more closely. And then we'll get back again to plenary for a final panel. And in that panel, you will have the chance to interact more actively with the panelists and to contribute to the discussion, also both in the chat, but also by raising your hand. So, you know, whatever form you prefer. So we want to, I just want to say also that we want to thank both our panelists, but also like a small group of experts in this field that recorded some short videos ahead of the session. I hope you have watched all the videos, but if you didn't, I'm sure that you will still have very valuable insights from this discussion today. So just to have an idea of the diversity of perspectives of the people in the room, we will start with a short poll question for everyone. I'll ask Gabriel if he can set up the poll. So the question is, based on your expertise and work experience, what is your view on the added value of resilience approaches to peace building? And then you have these four options below. Great. We see how these are running, and we see that number 2 seems to be the more popular. So I guess that most people in the room seem to be more pro-resilience than skeptical to resilience. But we really want to try to bring both perspectives in the debate. So I hope we succeed with that. But it was great to have this first overview. Thank you so much. So I will just very quickly introduce our panel. So first we have Cedric de Koning, who is from the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and African Center for Constructive Resolution of Disputes. Then we have Olga Petroniak from Mercy Corps, Fonte Akum from the Institute of Security Studies, and Yunador Twanji from the Institute of Development Studies, IDS. And now I think we jump in directly to this discussion, and I can hand over to Robyn.
Hey there. Thank you so much, Cibele. Can you all hear me, or just nod if you can?
Yes, we hear you fine.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's 3:37 p.m. here in Stockholm. A very good day to you wherever you are in the world. I am honored to be asked to moderate this panel with such incredibly talented and passionate experts. During my 17 years as a journalist, mostly on the African continent, I've been confronted time and again with incredible stories of resilience, from blind children committed to continuing their education through wars and famine in Mogadishu, to small informal businesses in my home country of Zimbabwe, who still managed to turn an honest profit against all odds. But I realized while researching the subject matter that my definition of resilience is slightly different to someone else's, or to be taken in a different context. So I enlisted the help of a friend who works both on the ground in peace and development, but also for a multilateral organization in countries such as Somalia, Ethiopia, and Syria. And he told me that resilience desperately needs to be defined at the outset, because usually the biggest problem is, number one, donors and implementers mean something different. Number two, donors and the communities they're working with mean different things. And number three, in his words, it can also be a nebulous term, in his words, removed from reality. So I realize this is controversial, but I wanted to spark some debate. And I would like to, of course, ask our panelists for their takes on resilience. But just a quick note in terms of audience engagement, we do want your engagement, but this portion of the workshop is just a Q&A between myself and the panelists. But do feel free to write your thoughts and comments in the chat section on Zoom, or you can tweet us using the Stockholm Forum hashtag, and later on we will get to some of those. So without further ado, I'd like to start with Fonte Akum of the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa. And Fonte, you describe yourself as a bit of a skeptic when it comes to resilience, especially when it comes to violent extremism. But is it possible, do you think, that we can find a resilience balance?
Thank you, Robyn. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to first of all thank the organizers for inviting us to be part of this panel. Working within a policy research organization, I approach every issue with a healthy dose of skepticism, and it helps us actually critically engage with both resilience and peace building. For us, it's useful to not start with a definition, but start with a context. And 4 years ago, we set out to understand why some individuals, young and not so young, men and women, decided to heed the siren call to violent extremism in the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin, while others living in the same circumstances actually did not do that. The work has been supplemented later on by an attempt to understand resilient livelihoods in the shadows of Boko Haram. Now, the life histories garnered from the first set of cases and the process dynamics gleaned from the second set of cases actually points to a complex interplay of individual, community-based, and structural factors, which almost mirror resilient reasons with the reasons why individuals join these groups. So within the same context, with an interconnection or the mirroring of resilience and violence, it would be useful to be a little bit skeptical about programming around resilience, particularly when it's part of the livelihood experiences of the individuals within borderland communities. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Fonte. That was very interesting, and we can't wait. I particularly look forward to hearing more about the Lake Chad Basin and your expertise there, just because that's what I'm interested in. Olga Petriniak, from a programmatic aspect for Mercy Corps, a great NGO I've covered before, doing amazing work. Have you seen effective practical examples of resilience and peace programming?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question, Robyn, and for having me on the panel today. I do think how you look at resilience and how you define that concept is very important. And I think I need to do that in order to answer this question well. So I want to just start by highlighting what we mean when we talk about resilience at Mercy Corps. So we're an organization that works across the humanitarian development and peace spectrum in over 40 countries, many of which are defined by fragility and conflict. And we see daily that the communities, institutions, and businesses we partner with are repeatedly affected by this domino effect of shocks, be they climate related, economic, health related, that undermine their well-being, but also negatively affect peace and stability. And interestingly, COVID-19 brought the reality of disruption to daily life and its many secondary effects to a global stage. But in the context where we work, communities precisely face these kind of debilitating disruptions multiple times a year. So we understand resilience to be the ability of people and systems to protect, but also to advance their well-being in these kind of complex risk environments. The resilience is not just about protecting the status quo, but supporting transformation in the face of shocks. So it's not the end goal, but sort of a key necessary outcome along that pathway to achieving a lasting peace. So to come to your point, do we see greater impact when we link peace and resilience building measures? The answer is definitively yes, and I'll come to the example. So I'll talk about some of our work in North Kivu in the DRC, where we have been highly successful in integrating market systems development, land governance efforts, and peace building measures to promote long-term food security and peace in a context affected by conflict and climate shocks. So this is an area rife with conflicts around livelihoods, land, identity, and at the same time, communities here are suffering from decreased agricultural production and land degradation due to the effects of climate change, which of course further fuels the conflict. Then there's Ebola, price fluctuations, you name it. So here we took a two-pronged approach. We partner with peace and development committees to support dispute resolution and mediation across conflicting groups, and strengthen the ability of this committee to serve as a platform for collective land negotiation. And at the same time, we facilitated broad market linkages across farmers, agribusiness, microfinance institutions, and through this facilitated access to improved technologies and practices, production practices that could help communities with the context of a changing climate. So what did all this achieve? We saw increase in freedom of movement and a decreased reliance on negative coping strategies. In our evaluations, we saw a 22% increase in respondents saying they were very or fairly hopeful about the prospects of stability in their community. And at the same time, a similar increase in adults who believed their livelihoods would allow them to cope with shocks in the future. We saw a marked increase in uninterrupted access to land, also land distributed across diverse ethnic groups, and we saw a corresponding boost in incomes. And I just wanted to close this part by saying that from our research in Northeast Nigeria, we see that many of the same conditions that support peace also support resilience in conflict settings. Through secondary data analysis, we found that many of the same factors that reduce the likelihood of participating in violent extremism, as Fonte talked about, also support people to achieve food security when they're faced with conflict and economic shocks. So there is an opportunity to get dividends from both, and they really are mutually reinforcing.
Wonderful. Thank you, Olga Petroniak. We do appreciate it. Just to give you a real quick summary, resilience, definitely yes. Can resilience perspective add value to peace building? And Mercy Call from a programmatic aspect says definitely yes. Thank you so much, Olga. Well, next, let's head to Jennido Wanji from the Institute of Development Studies in the United Kingdom. Jennido, your focus of your research is on security across border areas, and you describe resilience at its worst as a buzzword, policy infatuation, even a contingency plan within a diminishing aid budget. Can you unpack that further for us, please? And I believe you are muted.
There we go. I'm sorry. Hi again, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to take a few of your minutes to talk about resilience. All right, my name is Jennido Wanji, as I've been introduced, and at the Institute of Development Studies, I'm working on a multi-site project, which is looking at resilience from below, so resilience from a community perspective. And the reason I'm saying that resilience resilience has become a sort of a buzzword, and many scholars are saying this. I'm not the first one saying it. Is just because of the presence of the concept in just about every field of study at the moment. Um, uh, Disaster risk and reduction, epidemics, psychology, and now peace building. And of course, there is in this paradigmatic shift, the notion that the adoption of resilience as a conceptual tool in peace building um, maybe emerges from the malleability of the of the context of the concept in the context of uncertainty. So it's rather than from paying specific attention to how resilience operates on the ground. So there is this need to sort of vindicate the resilience approach to build peace building with actual elements from empirical research. There has been, you know, some research. There have been research initiatives that have examined resilience approaches in different areas of peace building, you know, such as education, post-conflict reconstruction, transitional justice, and gender in varying geographical contexts. But to describe such dynamics of resilience thinking in peace building efforts, critical scholars have put forward the many types of ideas like post-liberal peace. As Cedric de Koning here has, you know, come up with the term adaptive peace building, which is a new approach to sustaining peace, whereby international peace builders work with local communities to engage in peace processes. But the conceptual and sort of empirical insight provided by these research initiatives, uh, I mean, contributions to the turn to resilience in peace building help map both the promises and the pitfalls of using resilience to address the international community's failure to secure improved outcomes for populations in prolonged crisis context, and including those are mainly shaped by conflict. So as much as resilience now describes externally led projects and initiative in peace building, the term portrays in the inherent capacity of local communities to address conflict-related societal issues. I think Olga has already mentioned this, and this is very important because this is the point of the tension here. There is a case to argue that peace building must integrate at least, you know, this societal approach to resilience that emphasizes the internal capacities, but at the same time, at the same time, speaking to a wider skepticism about the neoliberal take on resilience, as seen as discussed earlier. uh, Critics of this understanding of resilience would point out the naturalization of uncertainty at the and the rejection of external intervention to address crisis, which is more often than not rooted in the type of governance agenda imposed on populations. So I'm not uh, entirely skeptical about resilience in peace building. I think there's still an issue when it comes to peace building to define what we mean by resilience. Is it something that we observe and try to harness, or is it an idea that we already have, a coherent agenda that we already have, and that we want to impose on communities? I think this is where the question is still not answered, and probably maybe we can find more answers here today.
All right, thank you so much, Jennifer. We do appreciate it. Let's go now to Cedric de Koning of NUPI in Oslo. And you describe your research, and Jennifer gave you a little bit of a, gave us a taste of that, as institutional, focused on the AU and UN peacekeeping and peace building efforts. Do you believe that resilience of social systems will prevent conflict and sustain peace?
Thank you so much, Robyn, and thank you everyone for joining us for this very interesting and engaging discussion. I do also work on adaptive peace building and engaging with peace building at a local community level. But I thought that maybe I should, in this conversation, at least in the start of our conversation, also touch on resilience at other scales, because the conversation about resilience often tends to focus very much on local community or local society level resilience. And perhaps one way to think about resilience at the institutional level or at other scales is to think about how COVID-19 has disrupted the United Nations, for example, as one major actor in this area. We at NUPI specifically do research on the African Union and the United Nations, and especially in the area of peacekeeping and peace building. And it was very interesting to see how the pandemic has, disrupted not only a particular peacekeeping operation, as may happen when there's, for instance, a natural disaster, as we've seen with an earthquake in Haiti or volcanic eruption in North Kivu and Goma. But here we had a major systemic disruption that affected all the peacekeeping operations across the world, as well as the headquarters at the same time. And I think what was interesting is how the different missions and the institution basically managed to continue to function despite this major disruption. They made huge adaptations to their methods of work. So for instance, in the peacekeeping context, they had to reprioritize what it is they can do and not do in terms of carrying out their core mandate, like protection of civilians, whilst at the same time doing things like freezing the rotation of troops, limiting all movement, people working from home or from their offices. And so, and especially I think what made the institution quite resilient in this context was the use of technology, the fact that they have already invested before the crisis in the ability to communicate via video teleconferencing, not just between the missions and the headquarters, but also between the missions and their field offices and so forth. So this is an interesting, I think, example of how a major, huge institution can be disrupted by a crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic and show resilience at that scale. But I also want to mention that resilience can also be negative, in the sense that there can be path dependencies of negative behavior in an institution like the United Nations or in a local community, which are also very resilient to change. For instance, actors in a particular community that are committed to using violence to achieve their interests, and that therefore are resilient to efforts to bring peace to that community. So we do need to recognize that resilience is not necessarily only positive, that other actors can also have resilience. And I think that's part of what we need to take into account. Thank you so much, and back to you, Robyn.
Thank you so much, Cedric. So it's not just the system itself that is resilient to change. Negative actors also resilient to change. So we have 4 minutes and we have 4 panelists. So let's try and keep the next answer to a minute each. Fonte, I'll start with you. How can understanding resilience contribute to violence prevention and peace building? And may you give us a couple of examples of where you've seen it work effectively, Fonte?
It would be extremely difficult to unpack that in 1 minute for panelists, but I think resilience can contribute to peace building, first of all, by understanding exactly the practices that we're trying to promote in the very social context within which they exist. Second, we don't need to shift the burden of expectations to local communities in the absence of service provision. One of the basic services of which is simply protection and security. If communities are not secure in the spaces within which they live, it's extremely difficult to actually shift the burden of resilience onto them. Thirdly, I think it's worth minimizing the distortions that occur when you try to re-engineer existing social norms and social capital within particularly the case of liminal spaces. And by limiting these distortions, you can actually start working to disentangle patterns of negative resilience from patterns of positive resilience as well. And if I may add one last point, it's worth also looking at the very engines of violence within these spaces. When you look at the use of a motorcycle, for example, a motorcycle is used as the main means of transport in most of the northeast of Nigeria, as well as in the Sahel. But motorcycles are also a huge vector for violent extremism within these spaces. Responding to the use of motorcycles through inhibitions or the limiting of the use of motorcycles actually limits the livelihood possibilities for individuals who use this very means of transport to ensure their livelihood. So, I mean, these are different ways in which we could try to understand issues within their specific context and then design responses which are adapted to specific local realities while taking into account the necessity to strengthen capacities for local service delivery. Thanks.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Engines of violence. I enjoyed some of the puns you made in that as well. Thank you, Fonte. Now, I did say that everyone would have a minute to answer one more question, but we are instead going to go straight to the breakout sessions. And after that, we will get back to the rest of you for follow-ups. Thank you so much. And this has been fascinating as a journalist, and I'm going to hand over to Cibele now. Thank you.
Thank you, Robyn. And thank you so much to our panel for the great discussion so far. It has been super interesting to listen to all of you. So we will now be randomly divided, or almost randomly divided, apart from the panelists, among 4 breakout groups for a 20 minutes discussion. It's not so much time, so we will try to keep it focused. And I guess that the main focus of the discussion, we want to hear your take on this perspective. So what do you see it's the value or of resilience, or what could be the risks of resilience, and sort of have an honest discussion about that. And also, like, you know, if there are risks, what measures could be taken to mitigate those risks if we want to use resilience approaches to peace building. So I will ask Gabriel here to just divide this across the 4 groups, and after the 4 groups, we will get back to the second and final panel.
We're back.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Alrighty, I'm gonna get going. Welcome back to session 2. It is just gone 20 minutes past 4 p.m. here in Stockholm. And that was a fascinating breakout session that I just sat in on. And I would like now to invite each of the panelists who were moderating that breakout session to comment on what their breakout group had to say. You each have 1 minute. And Olga, if you are there, I would like to start with a quick summary of what your group had to say.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We had quite a lively and interesting discussion. I think the first reflection was that there are still a lot of diverse perspectives. So can we understand more practically what does resilience look like? So we kind of got into a discussion around, you know, really understanding coping mechanisms, and it's about coping in complex risk environments, but then quickly moved to, well, what about the transformative aspect, and understanding transformative capacity as part of resilience to kind of lift up the status quo and move to a higher state of well-being. We talked about the need to really understand context, understand the root causes, the various drivers of conflict, to really be able to understand where to plug in resilience, and that context really matters. And I think Fonte articulated that also in his opening. We talked a little bit about the different levels of resilience, individual, community, and state, and that resilience is kind of applicable at all three. But again, understanding how those levels relate, that a resilient community might be crushed by a kind of a negative state, I guess, or that an individual may be resilient but might not be able to thrive if they're not in a community that creates the enabling environment for resilience. And then just a final reflection that there was resilience is a useful common goal if we understand it not in sort of the most conservative sense, but in that transformative sense. But we need to simplify the language, and we need to kind of all get behind it rather than having sort of, it's useful to have these diverse debates, but in terms of what we're doing across the humanitarian development peace spectrum, what we're trying to do to drive collective outcomes, let's kind of simplify what we mean so that we can collectively get behind a shared goal and objective. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Olga. Fonte, I sat through your group. Would you give us a 1-minute summary of what the group had to say, please?
Absolutely. Thanks, Robyn. My group actually looked at the question, the definitional nuances and complexity with actually identifying what exactly resilience is. The second issue that we looked at was the basic scale of resilience, and it raised a question about whether why it is that we look at resilience mainly from the community angle rather than looking at it from beyond the community level angle as well, and seeing ways in which you can connect the skills to have a sort of a snowball of resilience. The third was basically the politics of resilience itself. When you're looking at issues of social service delivery, you're looking at questions of responsibility being shifted to the victims of in context of violence. Then you realize that operationalizing resilience actually comes with a very high threshold. And finally, we looked at the processes themselves of intervention and the very mechanics which enhance community resilience. And I think an important point was raised, and that is the fact that communities are not necessarily isolated. And given that they're not isolated, why are interventions so focused on the communities and not necessarily on other skills, which also could possibly incorporate the state? So I think that this special disaggregation might be useful to understand it in context, but it needs to be integrated to broader interventions, just like Olga noted, with the humanitarian peace and development nexus. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Fonte. Judina?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And just in 1 minute, right? I think in my group, we agreed that we need to be very careful with, first of all, the possibility of using resilience, to as an excuse for institutions to evade their responsibility. And secondly, to be aware of this sort of dual aspect of resilience, where you have a sort of negative, in quotes, resilience or system which can be oppressive, being resilient, as well as communities on the other hand. So, but the question is, what is the alternative? And this is what one of our group members asked: what's the alternative? What do we do then? Do we not include resilience in peace building? And the answer we've tried to find by our discussions is of two aspects. I think the first one being that yes, we can use resilience, as a contribution in improving peace building approaches, but we need to have a sort of holistic approach, which means that resilience should take into account things like the cultural dimension of inherent capacities, in order to make sure that what we refer to as resilience is actually the capacities of the community. And secondly, which at least two group members have agreed that resilience is not a solution itself, but is a way of looking at challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And this can inform us on what are the needs in terms of peace building, rather than what is the the solution in terms of peace building. So it's not innovative in itself, but it's an innovative way of looking at existing problems.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Judino. Cedric?
Thank you very much, Robyn. And first of all, apologies to my group because this window popped up that said we only had 56 seconds left or something. And then instead of, and I wanted to close down the window, but I actually left the room and left my group alone for the last 40 seconds or something. So apologies for that. But we had a great discussion, and it ranged, I mean, it really covered the spectrum. Was talk about, how the word resilience can be and are being instrumentalized and is used as a buzzword on the one end of the scale, but also how on the other end of the scale, there's a science around resilience, and especially around complex adaptive systems and understanding how systems respond to change and how systems can be influenced, and that we can learn from especially those areas in sustainability science and ecosystems where this has been further perhaps developed than in the peace field, and that we can rely more on that. And then also Noura Ahmed from the Queiroz Center, I think, came with a very useful suggestion that we should move beyond just discussing the concept to focus more on, for instance, identifying how we can use the concept more functionally. So for instance, focus on indicators of resilience and understand what those are, and so that we can more practically engage with what resilience mean, as opposed to just being stuck in discussing the concept. So thank you. Thanks. Back to you, Robyn.
All right. Thank you all very much. That was very interesting. We will now open the audience up to questions and comments from participants. So open the panel up to questions and comments from participants, starting with, we would like to start with someone who sent in a video earlier and posed questions via a video, but you can also put your questions in the chat site. You can also tweet us or using the Stockholm Forum hashtag, and of course, raise your virtual hand. I will try to keep a lookout, but let's start with Brendan Sharon Brown. He is an assistant professor at the School of Religion at Trinity College Dublin. Brendan, in your video message, you specifically referenced Palestine and the concept of resilience. Can you take us through why you believe imposing Western concepts of resilience on Palestinians is problematic, and is there a solution? And you are muted.
Yeah, thanks very much. Am I muted still though? Oh, you can hear me now? Okay. Thanks very much for the thanks for the panel. Thanks for putting it together. I think it's super interesting to hear so many divergent views on this, and yeah, really fascinating. I guess my first sort of comment in general would be that the interdisciplinary nature of resilience, I think, is really important, and it's something that should be heralded, and we should be really we should be grateful for that. But in my own context, when we look at Palestine, resilience is pretty much a way of trying to protect the international community from its utter failure when it comes to involvement in the Palestinian theater. I mean, Palestine has been destroyed by humanitarian intervention. It has created a humanitarian crisis and a developmental bubble. So it's no surprise to me that the language of resilience has now been adopted by international organizations to protect humanitarian gains, or at least to try and attempt to do that. And in many ways, I think the language of resilience is just politically sensitive resistance. It's trying to pacify an indigenous community who are facing ongoing ethnic cleansing. And so you get many as a situation where you have international organizations developing resilience programs for Palestinians, and whilst turning a blind eye to ethnic cleansing that's happening in and around them. So I'm not really sure resilience is all that useful when it comes to that sort of context. Then the last thing I would say is, the language of resilience is used, albeit not using the language of resilience. Palestinians have used the language of samud, which means steadfast in Arabic. So is it not the same thing? Why do we need to create a new language around resilience? So I think we need to be careful that we just don't impose Western lenses and Western eyes upon context that we have a lot to answer for, really.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brendan. We have heard quite a lot of hammering of the idea of resilience, but let's hear a different side of it. Jen Abdullah is the Director of Climate Resilient Development at the Near East Foundation. And thank you, Jen, for sending in or helping to send in Yamadou Diallo's video for us ahead of time. And I would encourage you all to watch that if you haven't. Do you believe that we too often focus on micro levels or macro levels? I know that you spoke about this in the previous forum, and you also said resilience doesn't necessarily mean stability. Can you take us through what then you believe resilience means if it does not mean stability? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so at the Near East Foundation, we look at resilience as a vehicle for promoting resilience building activities for promoting positive relationships, trust, stability, reconciliation at the grassroots level among communities, and as a way to engage people who often are not involved in formal peace building efforts. We do, as I think Olga said, we also view resilience as a means to an end. It's not an end in and of itself. So you can have stability, but it doesn't necessarily mean there's resilience. And in our view, the capacities, the networks, the institutions, the assets that enable communities to reduce vulnerabilities and weather all kinds of multidimensional threats, whether we're talking about climate change or economic crises, a pandemic, also are those that are critical to inclusion and managing conflict and avoiding violence, and ultimately to achieving a durable peace. As some of the panelists noted, we think this has real promise for promoting local voices and priorities in peace building, not as victims, but as empowered actors in managing conflict and fragility. We think there's real promise, and that promise is realized in local resilience building efforts that are linked up with conflict mitigation. So in informal peace building and at local scales, in our experience and our work. I guess a question that I have, and maybe that I could ask the panelists, we see this promise realized at local level, building relationships, helping communities strengthen the institutions that help them to be inclusive and manage conflict at the local level. But within formal peace building efforts or across different scales, does resilience as a concept meet this promise? And if not, can it, and how?
Would anyone in particular like to answer that question, or can I just say, Cedric, would you be willing to answer that question?
I can try. Thank you very much, Jen. Great to see you again. I mean, one of the areas I work in at the moment is on the linkages, so relationship between climate change and conflict. And that's one area where it's very interesting to see the engagement across scales, so from the Security Council down to the local level, and how action at one scale can influence action at other scales, and how those scales can be brought together. So you may, for instance, have a local civil society actor actually being invited to make a presentation to the Security Council, and have that kind of direct link from that local level right into the highest policy levels. And then it's interesting to see how, for instance, let's say particular language in a Security Council resolution is linked to prioritization, resources and actions that may or may not have a particular, then say, effect on helping local communities to strengthen their social institutions and so forth. So I hope that helps somewhat. Thank you very much, Robyn.
All right, thank you so much, Cedric. A question posed in the group chat is from Karen Geldner-Ebenthal, and she asks, one question I've struggled with is that the discussion is too often not taken into account that resilience can be inherently political, particularly its transformative aspect that might require to challenge existing power structures. It is far less technical in real context, Karen says. I think this not bad at all, just needs to be acknowledged more, especially by actors that want to engage. Olga, I see you answering. Would you mind answering that for us and Karen? Thank you.
Sure, and I think it's actually quite related to the previous question around whether resilience is useful to think about at kind of, beyond the community level. We recognize, for example, in our work and our thinking, that for communities to be more resilient, meaning they access the resources they need, they have the behaviors to kind of manage these shocks and stresses, they need to live in an environment that enables that. And that includes effective good governance that provides those basic services. It includes regulations that enable markets to reach the last mile or enable, kind of climate adaptive technologies to reach certain people in certain contexts or what have you. So it's certainly, resilience is a concept that cannot be divorced from the enabling environment and the norms, the rules, the regulations, and the governance systems around that. And I think we need to very actively be working in the space. And of course, that very much dovetails with the peace building space. And how do you look at governance systems and transfer governance systems to enable peace to thrive? So we absolutely need to be looking at that level. And it to kind of connect work with civil society, with formal government institutions, as well as alternative sources of legitimacy and power, and ensuring that we're challenging existing power structures to be more inclusive.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Olga. I do see Melina Nathan has her hand up, and I would like to pass the microphone over there. But just a very quick reminder, please put your hand up if you have questions, your virtual hand. And also don't worry about thanking everyone. We are very thankful to everyone that is here, and let's just say all protocols observed. Thank you. Melina.
Thank you so much. The reason why I wasn't able to type my question out is because I found this session really interesting, but ultimately quite confusing. And I almost think that the culture wars, the academic culture wars, have come to resilience, and perhaps is getting in the way of the work that people do in the field. But just to give an example, I do think it might have been helpful to have unpacked the issues within resilience that are raising such a lot of controversy, because I have to say I haven't really heard of any convincing arguments from the naysayers. And I think the question from the question raised by Karen and Olga's response, it's quite clear that in that question, she's actually pointing out to the fact that resilience is inherently political, whereas the impression I was getting from quite a number of the panelists who were questioning resilience were criticizing it for not being political or transformative enough. So basically we are just expecting vulnerable communities to fend for themselves, and there should be changes occurring at different levels. Well, all of that is true, but at the end of the day, your house is on fire, you've got to put it out, and there are people who need to be assisted. And I think that's the bread and butter of the people who work in the field. So maybe it would have been more useful to talk about things like timeframes. If you talk about transformation, what timeframe are we talking about? It could actually take 30 to 40 years to transform lives of communities if you invest in things like education that allow people to fundamentally transform their lives. It's not going to happen in 2 or 3 or 4 years, which may sometimes be the attention span, of development actors or partners with their projects. So I just think this is a very important debate and a very important issue, but I'm not really getting the kind of empirical facts-based arguments I thought I would get. Thank you. Sorry.
All right, I would love for the panel to respond to this. This is very interesting. And do you guys agree these are part of the academic culture wars that has come to resilience? Would anyone in particular just put your hand up of the panelists who would like to respond to that? If not, I will just pick Fonte to do it.
Yes, listen, I think a lot of the work we do on resilience is informed by the responses that we have seen, particularly in the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin, which have been very securitarian in nature. you've got to juxtapose the threats that affect communities and the responses which are being advanced by states which normally are not necessarily threatened by those same threats. And the disaggregation of those threats actually makes the responses and the privileging of security-based responses a political act in themselves. When you speak of communities, you're speaking of territory, you're speaking of administration, you're speaking of security service provision as well. So I get it that resilience is a very difficult concept to handle. Definitionally, it poses a number of challenges. But when you go into the field to try to understand exactly how to disentangle negative resilience from positive resilience, right now, especially in the Lake Chad Basin, they remain very imbricated. The state, in some of these cases, seems to be part of the problem, even if its own resilience is being protected as well. So I'm sure, Melina, we will not be able to answer your question from a purely empirical base as you might desire, because we still struggle with the very definition of the concept. We still struggle about whether the intervention should take place at the level of an individual or at the level of the community or at the level of the state, and how to connect those different scales of intervention. And I'm sure that as we move forward with the definitional premise itself and in operationalization, we'll be able to move on that level. Thanks.
Thank you, Fonte. Gary Milante of Cibele, you can tell us from a donor perspective, and your video contribution talked about resilience, learning by trial and error, my words, not yours, through the anti-fragile resilience system, and you mentioned adaptive learning systems. And perhaps if you care to or can also address something that Melina said about empirical evidence as well. But can you tell us why you think resilience has potential?
Certainly. This is a fantastic discussion. Thanks. I was bullish on the term resilience, and I think we've had some really good pushback on it, which has been extraordinarily constructive. I think Jennida's point about it being a tautology, do we know whether we're really seeing resilience there? I think Adam's point in our breakout group about whether we can really whether we mean the same thing when we say resilience is a really good one. And I think Brendan's point about imposing resilience from the outside is a really good one. If it's truly adaptive, it's going to be owned by the people that are making the changes. So I think these are fantastic points. I think they're helping us to understand it better. I think Melina, I think there has been a lot of evidence here. I think Olga presented us with a lot of ways in which we see resilience happening. And I think it's okay that we have this these conceptual challenges. This is a big term, but peace is a big term. And we've managed to use the word peace many times in many ways at many different levels. And if you're looking for indicators, I would then say, well, what's the analog that we could use for resilience? And I think everyday peace indicators give us a very good example of how people have adapted indicators to respond to local peace that's being built, local challenges. And we saw a lot of examples from that from Olga about here are local resilience improvements, here are local shocks, here are local coping mechanisms, here are local challenges. So I would turn to examples like everyday peace indicators and say, what is the resilience that is being locally owned? And if the Palestinians have a different word, fantastic, use it, use that to be the thing they want to build. And then put some indicators there. What will it look like when there is more of whatever that thing is that's being built? What is the time frame? I think that's an excellent point. And let's not throw out the word that really what we want to see is adaptive change. Let's not throw out the word because we can't agree on what it means at the outset. Let's adapt and let's ourselves adapt and use it locally. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Gary. Olga, I see you have your hand up as well as Tamara. Olga, let me quickly come to you. And then I'll go ahead and read a couple of the messages, and then we'll come to Tamara. And just to let you know, we have 2 minutes until our Mentimeter, which I'm very excited about.
And let me try and take 30 seconds. I mean, I think the point about empirical evidence is very important, but I think there is a wide body of research that demonstrates that communities who have access to key resilience capacities, they have access to functioning markets, better social connections, flexible financial services, even in conflict contexts, do better on food security indicators, on income indicators, on psychosocial well-being indicators than communities that don't have those things. And often, you know, we look at conflict settings from either a humanitarian or a peace building perspective. We need to hold people on a lifeline, and then we need to build peace at the same time. And those two things are true, but at the same time, I think the point about the failure of the humanitarian system is a really critical one. It has undermined these resilience capacities time and time and again. Humanitarian systems in many places has undermined local markets. It has disrupted local social connections. It has disrupted mechanisms for social cohesion. And resilience points us back to those things. I think it's a way for humanitarians to acknowledge that they failed and that we need to do, sorry, that's a bold statement in this forum, but in some cases that failed, and that we need to do something more to preserve these resilience capacities and support them and transform them in these contexts. So just to say, I do think there's a lot of empirical grounded evidence on how we can support resilience capacities, even in crisis contexts. And I do think the term adds value in terms of pointing us to how we work differently across humanitarian development and peace building.
Thank you so much, Olga. It is that time. Tamara, please stand by. I do want to get to your question, but it is that time when we're going to use the Mentimeter. And
I will just share my screen, sorry.
Thank you.
Let's see.
So how this will work is, in one word, what do you think about,
sorry.
No problem. In one word, what do you think about when you think of the use of resilience in peace building approaches? And you can type in 3 words per maximum of 3 words per participant. So that's in one word. What do you think about when you think of the use of resilience in peace building approaches? Where do we type it, I guess is the question.
Yes, so you go to this www.menti.com. There is over here at the top of the page, if you haven't used Mentimeter before, and then you just put this code that is here, these numbers. It takes a couple of seconds, but then it goes really fast after that.
Fantastic. So I'll just go ahead and read while you are doing this, hopefully, a couple of the comments. So Samuel Scanlon says, I think Brendan Sharon Brown's point's very important, and I'm glad it was raised. The attempt to impose Western language in peace building models like resilience in contexts such as Palestine is just the new face of the system that has created a system of unsustainable and unhelpful industry of international involvement. Rather than forcing the adoption of our language, we should instead empower and elevate the oppressed in a disempowered, especially in asymmetric conflicts. Thank you so much. Samuel Jeff Peterson says, how could food be secure if elements such as soil and water and dependence such as nutrition cycling lacks resilient ecosystems taxed by parasitic peoples? And I apologize, my screen just disappeared. Parasitic peoples, pollutions, great alliteration there, and placements process now endangered by the virus. So that is Jeff Peterson. I'm not sure if any of the panelists would like to address either of those issues. I'm still, we are seeing some words coming up on the Mentimeter: buzzword, complexity, holistic, multidimensional, coping mechanisms. These are fascinating. Please go ahead and put your words in as soon as possible, because I believe we do only have 30 seconds to do so.
Robyn, it's Cedric. Maybe I can try to answer some of those, to respond to some of those questions by saying I guess part of the frustration I hear is the fact that we know these various elements and scales and timeframes are highly complex and entangled, and it's very difficult for any one of us to try and understand, you know, the whole system and how it all operates. That's what we mean when we say something is complex. So each one of us are working in the particular area that we have capacity in the discipline or in the engagement or at the level. And I guess one of the main things about resilience is about trying to connect all these different activities and initiatives that we undertake by sharing information, by creating networks, and by doing that, we are creating a kind of a self-organizing system that makes and connects all of these different activities. And the more we are able to connect, whether it is within communities or between communities and societies, and connect these different networks, the stronger, in a sense, these different systems become. So I think this is one of the dimensions that may be challenging. So when it comes to, you know, the soil question, obviously that is something that develops at a completely different scale, and to which people have to adapt in many different ways. It may not necessarily be about, you know, having the ability to change the soil, but then people respond by, you know, either adapting to the kind of crops that can be planted there, or by changing their livelihood options in other ways. And so these are all the different ways that we are grappling with, but it's the way we respond to these challenges and do that in a way that make our societies continue to thrive and even to transform is what we are capturing when I think we talk about resilience. Thank you. Back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Cedric. Tamara Niskovic has been standing by. We are running very short on time, so Tamara, if you'll keep it as quick as possible, I apologize. This is fascinating. And then if you would like to ask it to a specific person, please go ahead and say who you would like to pose the question to.
Yeah, no, I actually just wanted to contribute to the debate because I find this extremely useful also for my work. So just like a quick background, and I will just say like my perception of this topic. So the background is the UN agency called UNICRI, and I did evaluation of 83 projects working in North Africa and Sub-Saharan region, which the focus was violent extremism. And actually the whole topic of it was enhancing resilience of local communities to radicalization and violent extremism. The conclusion, so that's the intro, the conclusion that I've reached is that there is no need to enhance resilience of local communities. And the way I came to this conclusion was looking at the definition. I've tried to define the resilience in this context. So what I have looked at in this, again, I understand we have different backgrounds, so I'm just going to explain in this context. So I've looked at the American Psychologist Association's definition, which defines resilience as the ability of a person or a community, as a group of persons, to withstand adversity. In my case, this meant violent extremism. How do you define violent extremism? That is then going back to the number of explosions or killings that occur.
I'm terribly sorry, but we are running so low on time, and we still have
so I'll be very quick. I'll send them 2 sentences. So our definition of resilience was like, the communities are resilient because they have chosen to live despite the adversity in these communities, which means then one has to look how to help them build peace. And that community cannot do because it's already locked in a conflict. So that means you have to go back to the structures, be it civil society, be it then the national authorities. Because the communities, again, I would just like to say, like, they are resilient. So building resilience per se is not a solution. It's just an element to study. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. I would like now to hand over to Albert Nystrom, who will close it out. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Robyn. And sorry, I really feel like the bad guy now. I'm kind of ending a very dynamic discussion, and the spotlight is on me, and it's always extremely difficult. There's so many fantastic, insightful, and conflicting things that have been said here. I would love to have spent another 2 hours engaging with them. But I'll end with a bit of a personal reflection on why resilience could be important or should be seen as important, and what resilience might mean. I think to do that, it's important to understand the context and the epoch that we currently live in. And so I'll start by using a current ongoing shock that's affected us all. Right, so the COVID-19 crisis, right, has exposed in many ways, the vulnerability of our global society to systemic risks. What started as a small localized disease outbreak has cascaded across regions and sectors. It's had these massive impacts on global health, political systems, businesses, economies, everywhere, right? And it's getting increasingly obvious that, you know, us humans will increasingly be facing similar types of cascading cross-sectoral global shocks. I mean, there's empirical evidence now that there's a massive possibility that we've left an extremely stable phase in our planet's geological history into something much more nefarious, right? So actually one can see COVID-19 as a harbinger of a new global risk landscape that's the result of big human-driven changes to the Earth system, fueled by these massive levels of hyperconnectivity, and then things like pandemics, financial crashes, and synchronized food shocks. They're going to be propagating more rapidly than in the past and with greater geographic spread. And these shocks will be intersecting with one another, but just in the same way as COVID-19 has seemed to be compounding with locust outbreaks, flooding, geopolitical instability in the Horn of Africa. And in this context, in this new unstable, turbulent context we live in, it's vulnerable and marginalized groups that are disproportionately impacted. So new shocks end up reinforcing pre-existing conditions like environmental degradation, conflict, hunger. And so the question is, you know, we can't not engage with resilience. The question is, can we respond quickly enough to build a truly resilient future, one that reduces risks and is prepared and able to deal with shocks well beyond pandemics, right? And so I would say that while, just to tie back to some of the discussions that have been said in the breakout groups and in plenary, while it's great that there's this broad proliferation of commitments by big major policy actors like the UN, IMF, et cetera, to adapt resilience, we should really be concerned if resilience is merely used as a general attribute for recovery, or at worst, just as a path to bounce back. I think resilience really needs to address the fundamental necessities of transformation, and really address the fundamental changes required to navigate this new risk landscape that exists now. I think it's also important to acknowledge that, as people have said, resilience is not always positive, right? Highly problematic, unjust, unsustainable dynamics in the system can also be highly resilient. But resilience framework allows us to understand why these situations arise, right? And it helps understand what is it that keeps systems in unsustainable pathways. So it's a bit like an iceberg, you know. Resilience allows us to see what's beneath the iceberg. What are the norms and systemic issues like trade, financial flows, the economic system that actually locking locations and small context into unsustainable pathways. And finally, just to wrap up, I'm seeing Robyn is looking at her watch and we have 1 minute left, but I think just importantly, and this addresses some of the comments being made here, that resilient processes, whether in peace building or any sector you're thinking of, should be a pluralistic endeavor, right? So this really means bringing together academics from different disciplines, but also people from other sectors, government, business, civil society, local indigenous communities, to generate the knowledge around resilience, right? And how you measure and capture resilience. So this requires multiple knowledge systems, multiple types of expertise, and it really requires us all to be reflective, humble, and collaborative in how we engaged with others working with resilience. I'll leave it at that. I could say much more, but I'd just like to thank the Stockholm Forum and Cibele for hosting this whole conference. It's been brilliant. I'd like to thank the Global Resilience Partnership and the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and the Stockholm Resilience Center for hosting this session. A massive thank you to the panelists and Robyn for a fantastic discussion, and a great thanks for everyone else. And hopefully we all stay engaged in pushing this very important topic forward in the next coming years. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Albert. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much, everyone.